History lied to you about the world's greatest lover. Cleopatra didn't die for a man. She lived to dismantle an empire, and the woman we call a seductress was actually a cold-blooded architect who paved her path to the throne with the bodies of her own family. For 2,000 years, the shadow of a temptress has been cast over a figure who was far more dangerous, a master of manipulation who viewed the human heart as nothing more than a tactical entry point into the halls of power. If you look closer at the records left in the dust of Alexandria, you will find a narrative written in cold calculation and the quiet removal of anyone standing in her way. History has painted her in the soft colors of romance to make her palatable, but the truth is a shade of crimson that the world was never meant to see. The year is 51 BCE. The air in the royal palace of Alexandria is thick with incense and the unspoken scent of betrayal. Cleopatra VII is 18 years old, and she is already an outcast in her own home. The Ptolemaic dynasty into which she was born was not a family in any modern sense. It was a cage of golden vipers, where siblings did not share inheritance, they shared executioners. This was a bloodline that had practiced endogamy and assassination for centuries, a lineage of Greek pharaohs who ruled a land they never truly belonged to. At 18, she is forced to flee, chased into the desert by a younger brother who wants her head. Most would have vanished into the sands, consumed by the sun or the shifting dunes, but she was watching the horizon for a different kind of storm. She wasn't looking for a savior, she was looking for a weapon. That weapon arrived in the form of a Roman general with a thinning hairline and an insatiable appetite for conquest. The legendary meeting with Julius Caesar is often portrayed as a moment of whimsy, a queen wrapped in a rug to surprise a conqueror. But peel back the layer of myth and ask what that moment truly represented. It was a high-stakes gamble with a razor-thin margin for error. If Caesar had been unimpressed, she would have been handed over to her enemies and silenced forever. She didn't roll out of that carpet as a lover. She emerged as a partner in a hostile takeover. She used the only currency Rome respected, the promise of Egyptian gold and the strategic mastery of the Nile. She did not fall in love. She secured an alliance that allowed her to return to Alexandria and oversee the convenient disappearance of her siblings. By the time the dust settled, she was the sole occupant of the throne, but the price of that seat was a debt to Rome that could never truly be repaid. Life in the palace was not a series of banquets and silk. It was a constant exercise in survival. Cleopatra understood a truth that few of her contemporaries grasped. Power is not held by force alone, but by the perception of divinity. While her ancestors had remained distant and foreign, she learned the language of the people. She was the first of her line to speak Egyptian. She transformed herself into the living embodiment of Isis, a goddess on earth, creating a psychological barrier that made her untouchable to her subjects. Yet while she played the deity in Egypt, she played the diplomat in Rome. She walked the fine line between being a client queen and a sovereign threat. She knew that the Roman Senate feared her not because of her beauty, but because of her brain. When Caesar was struck down in the Senate, the world shifted beneath her feet. The alliance was gone, the protection was void, and the vultures of Rome were already circling the wealth of the East. The arrival of Mark Antony offered a second chance, or perhaps a second target. While romanticized as one of the greatest tragedies of all time, the union between the Egyptian queen and the Roman triumvir was a collision of two desperate ambitions. Antony needed her fleet and her treasury to fund his wars. Cleopatra needed his legions to keep her borders secure and her son's future certain. They created a court known as the Inimitable Livers, a circle of excess and luxury that served as a brilliant distraction. Behind the curtains of these legendary feasts, maps were being redrawn, kingdoms were being gifted to her children. She was carving a new empire out of the Roman landscape, using Antony as the pen to sign her decrees. She wasn't a woman lost in a whirlwind of passion. She was a sovereign building a buffer zone of vassal states to protect the heart of Egypt. But Rome does not forget, and it certainly does not forgive. Octavian, the cold and calculating heir to Caesar, saw exactly what was happening. He didn't frame the coming conflict as a civil war between Romans. He framed it as a crusade against a foreign witch who had ensnared a noble general. The propaganda machine of the ancient world began to churn, turning the brilliant polyglot and stateswoman into a caricature of decadence and manipulation. They turned her intelligence into sorcery and her diplomacy into poison. As the Roman fleet gathered at Actium, the atmospheric pressure in Alexandria began to drop. The Golden Age was ending and the shadows were lengthening. The Battle of Actium was the beginning of the end. But the real mystery lies in the silence that followed. As the Roman forces closed in on Egypt, the narratives become fractured and contradictory. Why did Cleopatra flee the battle? Was it a failure of nerve or a calculated retreat to save what remained of her wealth for a final stand? As Antony's world crumbled, he retreated into a self-imposed exile of the mind. But Cleopatra remained active, constructing a massive tomb that would serve as her final fortress. She began to experiment. Ancient texts suggest she studied the effects of various toxins, looking for a way out that was neither painful nor unsightly. She was preparing her final act, not as a victim, but as a director who refused to let Octavian write her ending. The final days in the mausoleum are shrouded in a darkness that history has never quite pierced. We are told of a tragic double suicide, of a queen who could not live without her general. But consider the political reality. Antony was a liability, a broken man who no longer commanded the loyalty of his troops. Cleopatra, however, was still a queen. She attempted to negotiate with Octavian, seeking to secure the throne for her children. It was only when she realized that Octavian intended to parade her through the streets of Rome in chains, to turn the living Isis into a trophy of war, that the final decision was made. The story of the asp, the small cobra hidden in a basket of figs, is the version we have accepted. It is poetic, symbolic, and fits the Roman narrative of an exotic, dangerous woman. Yet many scholars and investigators have pointed out the logistical flaws. A cobra's bite is not always fatal, nor is it quick or painless. To kill 3 people, Cleopatra and her 2 handmaidens, with a single snake in a matter of minutes is a biological impossibility. There were no marks on her body, no evidence of the struggle that usually accompanies such an end. Some suggest a hollow hairpin filled with a concentrated cocktail of hemlock and opium. Others whisper that Octavian, fearing a public execution would turn her into a martyr, may have provided the means himself, ensuring the problem of Egypt was solved quietly behind closed doors. What remains is the void where her body once lay. To this day, the tomb of Cleopatra and Mark Antony has never been found. It is one of history's most enduring disappearances. She vanished into the earth of the land she fought to protect, leaving behind only the stories written by her conquerors. They tried to bury the politician and leave us with the temptress. They tried to erase the queen who spoke 9 languages and managed a national economy, and replace her with a woman who lived for the thrill of the chase. But the silence of the desert tells a different story. It speaks of a woman who saw the end of an era coming and chose to vanish on her own terms. Egypt did not just fall. It was the final piece in a game of global chess that she played until the very last move. The fall of Egypt was the birth of the Roman Empire, a transition fueled by the gold of the Ptolemies and the blood of a queen who refused to be a servant. As the sun sets over the modern skyline of Alexandria, the mystery remains. Was she the tragic lover of legend, or a shadow figure who manipulated the foundations of the Western world from behind a veil of silk and incense. Perhaps the truth is buried in the one place Octavian could never reach, a hidden chamber beneath the shifting sands, where the Queen of Kings still waits for her story to be told correctly. The tragedy of Cleopatra is not that she died, but that she was never allowed to be seen for who she truly was. Every record we have was filtered through the lens of the men who defeated her. They turned her power into a scandal and her intellect into a weapon of seduction. They needed her to be a monster so their conquest could be a crusade. But if you listen to the echoes of the ancient halls, you don't hear the sighs of a lover. You hear the heartbeat of a strategist, the scratching of a pen on papyrus, and the quiet, steady breath of a woman who knew that while empires fall and kings are forgotten, a well-crafted myth is immortal. In the end, she achieved the one thing Rome could never take from her. She became an enigma. She transformed her defeat into a mystery that would haunt the human imagination for 2,000 years. The Roman Empire is dust. The statues of Octavian are cracked and headless in museum basements. But the name of the last pharaoh still commands the world's attention. She lost the war for Egypt, but in the dark theater of history, she won the war for the future. She remains the queen of the shadows, a figure standing at the edge of the light, forever out of reach, reminding us that the most dangerous person in the room is not the one with the sword, but the one who knows exactly how to make you want to put yours down. The gold was looted, the temples were repurposed, and the line of the Ptolemies was extinguished. But the legacy of the woman who held the world in her hands for a brief, flickering moment continues to burn. She was the architect of her own destruction and the author of her own legend. Whether she died by the bite of a serpent or the sting of a needle, she exited the stage before the lights could be turned out by her enemies. And in that final dark act of defiance, she ensured that the world would never be able to look at the history of power without seeing her face looking back from the shadows. Think of the precision required to maintain that image. She lived in a world where a single mistake meant a blade between the ribs or a cup of poisoned wine. She outlived her siblings. She outmaneuvered the Roman Senate for decades, and she managed to make the two most powerful men in the world her personal shields. This was not the work of a woman blinded by love. This was the work of a person who understood that in the Game of Thrones you either win or you disappear. She chose both. She won the immortality she craved, and she disappeared into a mystery that no archaeologist has been able to solve. The records tell us she was brilliant, but they focus on her charms because they couldn't admit they were outplayed by her mind. They called it sorcery because they didn't have a word for a woman who was better at mathematics and linguistics than the generals who tried to subdue her. She managed the grain supply of the Mediterranean, she stabilized a collapsing economy, and she did it all while the world's most powerful military was knocking at her door. The true thriller isn't her death. It's the life she led in the shadows of the palace, whispering into the ears of giants and watching them fall one by one. When you walk the ruins of the ancient world today, you are walking over the bones of an empire that she nearly brought to its knees. The Roman Empire became an empire because it had to consume Egypt to survive. Her gold built their roads. Her grain fed their armies. Even in her defeat, she became the foundation of everything that followed. She was the dark star around which the ancient world revolved. A strategist who knew that sometimes the only way to win is to let the enemy think they've already captured you. She remains the ultimate cold-blooded architect. She didn't just rule a kingdom. She designed a legacy that survived the destruction of her city and the erasure of her family. She knew that the world would remember her, and she took great care to ensure they remembered her as a goddess, a lover, and a tragedy. Anything to keep them from looking too closely at the politician who almost won it all. The Queen of the Nile was never a victim of fate. She was the one holding the cards, even when she threw them into the fire. The most chilling part of her story isn't the end, but the realization that we may never know the truth. She was a woman who spoke in tongues and thought in empires. As the sand continues to blow over the site of her missing tomb, we are left with the echo of a woman who refused to be defined by anyone but herself. She was the predator, not the prey, and in the silent halls of history, she is still watching, still waiting, and still winning the game she started 2 millennia ago. The crown may have been dying, but the woman who wore it was more alive, more calculated, and more dangerous than any legend could ever dare to suggest.